Deism has a belief in the existence of God, but basically it rejects any idea of revelation. It denies both the possibility and the necessity of revelation. So it is a natural religion. It comes by reason. The most common form of deism is the absentee landlord idea. God created the world and then sort of wound it up like a clock. He put the laws in place and then sat on in his heaven and sat down and rested, and the world just kind of keeps ticking on. If he does anything at all, he simply acts at it from a distance, but and in a very general way. There are certain innate abilities and certain natural laws that he put into place, and that's it. God's finished with it. They really mean it when they said God rested. He didn't do any more, basically. Deistic thinking leads to several errors. Many of the same errors that we have under atheism, you can get in deistic thinking. But I want to talk about 3 theological errors that come from deism. Because these 3 theological errors, in one form or another, are very prevalent in the church today. Now, this is probably where I'm going to end up getting a little bit of controversy and trouble, but I'm not any stranger to controversy or trouble, so I guess maybe that's just par for the course. There are 3, which I've mentioned in footnotes, but there are 3 basic theological errors that come out of deism. One of them is called Pelagianism. Now, Pelagius taught that Adam was neither sinful nor holy when he was created. He did not have positive holiness. Neither did he have sinfulness. He had the capacity both for good and for evil. And God created him with a totally free will. There were no restraints upon his will. He could determine totally out of his own being whether he would choose right or wrong, whether he would choose good or evil. He was created, according to Pelagianism, he was created subject to death. Death was not a consequence of the fall. It was something that would have happened anyway. And when he sinned for himself. He did not sin on behalf of the human race. He did not represent you and I when he stood before God in the Garden of Eden and when he deliberately partook of the forbidden fruit. He sinned totally for himself. He is not the federal head of the human race. Of course, I'm sure if you've thought ahead a little bit, you realize that if Adam did not stand in sin for me, Christ cannot stand for me in salvation. You can't have it one way in the New Testament and another way in the Old Testament. So there's no such thing as original sin. Adam sinned, and he had only one advantage over us. He didn't have an evil example. We have an evil example. We have Adam's example. We have a whole history behind us. And so we sin because we follow bad example. Adam did not have that bad example. Now notice this. In Pelagianism, every person has the capacity to be sinless. It is technically possible, according to this view, for you and I to be born and live our whole life and never commit sin. Now, they recognize the fallacy of this position, and so they say we do in fact sin, but they blame it back here on this evil example. They don't blame it on original sin. Universal sin is the result of education, bad example, and habit. And grace is unnecessary. We don't need God's grace to turn from sin. We are basically good people. And so therefore, we can turn from sin if we choose to do so. We don't need God's grace. Now that's an extreme form, and that's an ancient doctrine in the church, but it laid the foundation for the Socinian doctrine, which is much the same. And this won't cause you a problem either. It's when I get to the next one you might want to get upset with me. Socinius taught that God's justice does not require the punishment of sin. God's just kind of off there in his heaven, and he's created the world, and it's just kind of running on its own, deistic ideas. And so God's justice does not require any kind of punishment for sin. Justice is simply an effect of God's will. It's not part of his nature. It's not some kind of part of his attribute. It's just simply some aspect of his will. So God will freely forgive. He doesn't forgive us for Christ's sake. He just forgives. He's just like a great-grandfather sitting up there in his heaven and say, "Oh, my kids aren't doing too well today. They crucified my son. They're walking in rebellion against me. They're going their own way. I'll just forgive them. They're good kids at heart." That's the Socinian view of God, which comes out of Deism. Guilt is personal, and so there's no substitution that's possible. Nobody can take the substitution for our sin. So you see the implication of that. Christ can't die on our behalf. The guilt is personal, so we got to deal with it personally. They also teach that Jesus was not pre-existent. He is not the pre-existent Son. There's a denial of the Trinity. He was essentially human, but he possessed a peculiar fullness of the Spirit. Very liberal theology today. Deistic. Jesus had a special knowledge of God. That's what made him the unique person that he was. He had a special aspect, the fullness of the Spirit. He had a special knowledge of God. Therefore, he was a very unique person. At his ascension, he became Lord of all, because he just done a good job while he was here on earth. Nothing to do with the pre-planned purposes of God. Nothing to do with God's sovereignty. Just simply, he'd accomplished what he was supposed to do. And so when he ascended up on high, he became Lord of all. And so the Christian religion is one of many acceptable religions. It's a good religion. It's very acceptable. That's a brief outline of Socinianism. Now, this is the one that causes the trouble today. Another result of deism is Arminianism. I'm sure you all heard the term Arminian. The vast majority of the evangelical world, vast majority of the Pentecostal world have some form of Arminianism in their theology. And that's why I said if I don't get in trouble here, boy, I'll never get in trouble. All right, Arminianism teaches no such thing as original sin. Now, that's the official position of Arminianism. Most modern Arminianism does hold to original sin, but I'm looking at the teaching of Arminius himself, which laid the groundwork for modern-day Arminianism. Basically, Arminianism in its true form teaches there is no original sin, much like Pelagianism. It teaches that sin is not imputed, that we are not guilty of Adam's sin. The pollution that the sin of Adam brought is passed down to us, but we're not guilty of his sin. And the pollution that we receive from Adam is really a disease. It's a weakness. It's not really sin. Have you ever heard, and it's very famous, and I don't mean to reflect on the organization because it's done a tremendous job in helping people, but one of the big things of AA that for many, many years stumbled me was they called alcoholism a disease. The Bible calls it drunkenness and sin. Now I realize what they're trying to say. They're trying to talk that alcoholism becomes a bondage, and you need help to get broke through from that bondage. But when you call sin a disease, you leave the impression there's not much I can do about it. I'm just sick. I've heard homosexuality spoken of in that sense, and other things. Pollution, then, according to the Armenian position, is a disease or a weakness. So man is not under condemnation. How can he be under condemnation if he's sick? He needs sympathy. He needs help. He's weakened in his nature. And so in that condition, he cannot attain life, nor can he discover salvation without what they often call the grace of God, or the prevenient grace of God, the general grace of God that's upon the face of the earth that restrains sin. They usually don't have a view of saving grace that's required before a person can come to know the Lord. They really emphasize human free will. You have a right to choose or not to choose. That's the part that most of us get uptight about. Free will. What's free will? If human race ever had a free will, if they ever had a free will, and I hope to get to talk about the sovereignty of God today before we're finished. But if the human race ever had a free will, it was Adam that had it. Don't look at me like that. I'm going to let that sink in a minute. If the human race ever had a free will, it was Adam who had it. And that's a big if in my mind. Because you and I, nor anybody else, has the ability to choose the right. There is none that seeketh after God. No, not one. There is none righteous. You've not called me. I've called you. Why don't we seek after God? Because our whole life has been brought into the bondage of sin and Satan, and we cannot free ourselves. But Arminianism says we have the ability to choose. And you already know, if you've looked at my notes, I consider that an error. Arminianism says we have the natural ability to do good and to prepare ourselves to turn to God. And every argument, let me say this, and I didn't mean to start refuting the thing before I got going, but every argument that I have ever heard in favor of the position we're just looking at is humanistic. I have yet to find a good, solid biblical argument. Boy, we really gotten quiet today. That's all right. Think about it. Now, because we have the natural ability yet we have some inherited depravity and pollution, we do need the grace that the Holy Spirit gives to help us. It will counterbalance our inherited depravity. It helps us to cooperate in regeneration. And if we use this enabling grace properly, then we have efficient grace, which becomes the grace of evangelical obedience. But it depends upon how we are responding and what we do. Predestination in the Arminian view is predestination according to foreknowledge. God looked ahead and saw what choices you were going to make, so He predestined you to make them. You ever heard such stuff? God saw what you were going to do, so He just predestined you to do it. If somehow in the process you changed that, then you kind of threw God's predestination out. See, that's the deistic idea, that God is sitting up in the heavens and He's not really active in part. Christ's death, according to this view, is a sacrificial offering, not really a payment of debt to divine justice. Now again, most of the Arminian view that we come across haven't thought it through that far. That's one reason I'm teaching this course, is because we often hold to views that we've never thought through and saw their logical conclusions. His death is a substitute for the penalty, and the church is mainly a visible society. According to a true Arminian view, they would be totally against what Pastor Mike was just talking about. The church could not discipline. All discipline belonged to the state. The Lord's Supper and the memorial is a memorial. It's an act of profession and a means of moral improvement. That's the logical conclusion from deism. Now let me just say something else here before we go on, in case I don't get to it later. I believe the Bible teaches very clearly that God is sovereign, and that He rules according to His eternal purposes and decrees, and we cannot change it. Now let me say something. If there's any single area that God does not control, then God is not sovereign. And prayer is a waste of time. I wish we had one of these big pulpits here. But that's good. You're thinking about it. I can see it churning in your minds. And of course, I'm not able to answer all your questions and objections, because we don't have time to go into that aspect of it. But you see, if the person takes a deistic point of view, you're undermining the very nature and character and purposes of God. The other theism that we want to touch on is pantheism, which is a belief that God and the universe are identical. Monism is one of the essential doctrines of pantheism. That is, the universe is one single whole, closely connected parts. There's nothing beyond the universe. Universe itself is divine, or at least a divine principle. God, therefore, is mutable because creation is constantly emulating from God. It's a continuous creation. The world issues from God. There's nothing that's solid, that's fixed. The world exists because constantly and continuously, moment by moment, it's just emulating from God. So God is constantly changing. because the world is constantly changing. God is eternally becoming. Unfortunately, pantheism is found almost everywhere. It's a system of determinism. If the whole universe is God, then it must be a single perfect system. There can't be any alternative systems. So that if any part lacks any quality, the whole falls short of perfectionism and the whole universe falls apart. Pantheism is the work of nature, or worship of nature, I should say. And that's why we got extreme environmentalism today. We've got the kind of environmentalism that leads to materialism, existentialism that we talked about yesterday. But it also means we can love a tree, commune with its spirit. Last year, if you were in Pastor Mike's class, he showed you in some of the textbooks in our schools where there's actually this kind of thing happening. It's pantheism. So they will spike a tree to save the tree. They will spend money to save the whales. They will cry to high heaven about the killing of wolves. And the same ones who say they have such a respect for life and don't want to see that poor innocent little wolf killed, don't want to see that living, vital tree cut down, will kill the unborn, will kill the aged and the infirm. Because their God is nature. And the problem with nature is man. If we could get rid of man, nature'd be great. It's like the fellow that said, I love the human race, it's people I can't stand. That's really what it's at, where it's at. That's pantheism. Well, let's move on to polytheism. Polytheism is the worship of many gods. And we talked about yesterday, I think I showed you this chart, how that liberal teachers, theologians, show that ancient man developed from a process of right and wrong time to plant, to spirit customs, to gods, to multi-gods, to finally monotheism, and ultimately to atheism. That's what they teach. The actual fact is, it's the other way around. As far back as human race is concerned, there's been some form of monotheism. Primitive man started out with one God. It was as he corrupted himself. That's figure 9a. As he corrupted himself, he began to worship, as Romans chapter 1 tells us. He began to worship the sun, the moon, the stars, the fire and water and air and all those kind of things. And then eventually those things began to represent personalities. And he began to give name to them. And so he had his spirits and his customs and his etiquette, which he tied into his religion. He included pantheism, worship of nature, and then it went to polytheism, like Hinduism and ancient Egypt, the Greek and Roman gods, and so on, until modern man has come to atheism. It's not the history of man. Archaeological studies support the biblical view that monotheism was the original belief of human beings. But fallen man is especially attracted to polytheism. He's got to worship something. That's part of his nature. And of course, idolatry is a part of polytheism. And polytheism leads to degenerate living. Many gods, degenerate living. Remember the story of Ahab and Jezebel and who was it in the garden? Ahab took his, I had it in my mind, it's gone right that fast. Naboth's coffee, isn't it? Naboth. Right. All right. You remember the story how Jezebel had him put on high, and
then had him executed, and then Ahab took over the vineyard. Do you know that came right out of their mythology? One of the gods had gotten a bow, and another god wanted it, and the first god wouldn't give it up, so he belly ached until he got one of the superior gods to create an eagle that picked the young hunter's eyes out, and then the god was able to take over his bow. See, it leads to polytheism leads to degenerate living. Because if the gods act that way, if the gods act immorally, then why can't we? And it's a sign, polytheism is a sign of a culture in decay. And if you remember yesterday, we talked about the idea that our system, when you have more than one law, you have more than one God, you have polytheism. Our system is in decay because it's a polytheistic system. Okay, I'm going to have to move on here quickly. I see I got 0 up there, but it's not really right. I'm going to ignore it for a moment. Just giving you a rough time there, Don. All right, polytheism leads to dualism. Two conflicting ideas of gods or forces. One God good and one God evil. Remember the little thing that Tao that Brother Winky Pratney drew up here the other night? That's dualism. Which came out of, he thought, was it Taoism he called it. But it's true in all kinds of polytheistic societies. There's two conflicting ideas. Both are equal, usually in constant conflict. And the world is in existence because you've got these two antagonistic deities that are constantly fighting one with another. Man himself is seen consisting of spirit and of matter. One is usually higher than the other, and it depends which is on the ascendancy, what kind of man he is. There's that constant tension, which is only relieved by death. And I've given a quote from Socrates here. Oh, not really a quote, but I've paraphrased it. Socrates concluded that since virtue was knowledge, and no man sinned willingly, if we have proper knowledge, we can choose rightly. Sin to Socrates was mistaking something harmful for something good. Wrong choice or sin is always to the individual hurt. Right choice or virtue was always to individual advantage. Now the consequence of that is the Greek philosophers came to the idea that the only people that should rule in a society are philosopher kings, because they're the only ones that got the knowledge. And so Plato in his Republic propagated that view. The world of salvation would require philosopher kings. And we see that same thing working today. It's the moving towards the elite. We poor ignorant people don't know how to do anything. We got the all-wise politicians and wherever. I mean, they don't say it in those many words, but by the very actions that they take and the laws they pass, they tell us. We can't handle a gun. They got to tell us how to do it. We're too stupid to handle a gun. Never mind, their gun law is not going to change the criminal thing. If you read the papers, you know that there's no guns allowed for anybody in Japan, and yet crimes with guns are increasing dramatically in Japan. Nobody's allowed a gun in Japan. You hunters will appreciate that. I thought you would. Maybe I'll get out of trouble for what I said earlier by saying something like that. All right. The unity of the state, that's the big thing. Man is a creature of the state. And the state means his highest good. That is self-sufficiency. So we have pluralism. We have polytheism. We're said to live in a pluralistic society. We live in a polytheistic society. Pluralism and polytheism is the same thing. And I talked about the myth of neutrality the other day. But basically the myth of neutrality is being promoted to undercut Christian evangelism. All gods are equal. And so we hear a lot today about how bad these missionaries have been. They've destroyed the culture of the people. Well, Christ destroyed my culture too. Go back and read what the European culture was 1,000, 1,500 years ago. I'm glad Christ destroyed that culture. And yes, we destroy culture because culture is your religion. So when the gospel is preached and people embrace Christ, culture changes. Let me tell you something. We have what we have today in North America because of Christ. We have the most powerful economic and political unit in the history of the world because of the gospel. And we're losing it because we're turning from the gospel. See, the world is lost. The world is in sin. They need deliverance. They need Christ. They need the gospel. He is the answer. And when He's the answer, it changes everything. If you want to know what a culture without Christ is like, look at cultures where the gospel's never come. You want to live in that kind of culture? I know this is going to be, if somebody outside of here heard this, they'd accuse me of being racist, but that's trouble. That's all right. Somebody said yesterday he was a racist and believed in separation of the race. Should keep the stock car races separate from the horse races. But if we allow Eastern religions official recognition in this country, we're soon going to be like their original countries. Now you can call that racial, whatever you want to. I love those people. I've worked with Hindu people for many, many years. Done business with them, worked with them. They were called the Jews of East Africa. I just watched what I was doing when I dealt with them. But they were good people. They were friendly people. I liked a lot of them. They were friends. Nothing to do with what kind of, they're lesser people or less valuable. They're human beings of great, infinite value to God. But their religion stinks. It destroys the country. It destroys the economy. It destroys the politics. And Christ is the only one that will raise the nation above its great poverty. Sometimes I wish I was an orator. I a lot of words I'd like to stick into some of those things. Now, I want to detour just a moment to say something here. I do not condone some of the unchristian things that have been done to our native peoples in the pretense of presenting the gospel. I don't condone that. That's wrong. And in some ways, it's very good that it's coming out and being dealt with as it should be dealt with. But the fact still remains, whether it's our native peoples, whether it's the Hindus of India, or whether it's the pagans of Africa, or whatever it might be, if they come to Jesus Christ and they receive the gospel, their culture will change, the same as our culture changed. It's a surprise to a lot of people, but Jesus Christ was not a European. We always see Jesus, real white and looks like he came right straight from Europe. If you want to know what Jesus' skin color was like, go over to the Middle East and see what he looks like there. He had more of an Arabic look. What heresy, huh? Oh dear, where did I get into that? All right, so we cannot compromise with polytheism. You see, the church has got to get back to its place where it's willing to stand up and say right is right and wrong is wrong. Oh, it's not popular. You're considered narrow-minded, dogmatic. But you're right. It was kind of comical. forget which trip it was. I went back east. I flew back east. I don't remember, it was from my mother's funeral or something. And so I flew into Toronto, and I took the bus from Toronto to Woodstock, or wherever it was. Woodstock it would be. And in there I met a minister from England and two people from Baha'i. And so we had some interesting conversation until the guy from England got into dispensationalism, and I had to shut up because I wasn't going to contradict a Christian in front of Baha'is. But anyway, I listened to the conversation after that, after I got out of it. And they said to him, of course, Baha'i, everybody's right, it's just kind of everything's okay. And so they said to him, well, have you studied our religion? He says, I don't need to. I've got the Bible. I've studied the truth. I mean, he didn't put it quite that plainly, but that's what he said. Oh, he said, you're just closed-minded. Well, the conversation went on, and I forget what he said, but he talked something that Jesus said, I am the way, the truth, and the life. And boy, they backpedaled on that, but this and this and this and this. And I just turned around and I said, now who's closed-minded? Because they had shut it right off. They wouldn't accept that because that came from the Bible. Don't accuse him of being closed-minded. You're closed-minded. See, that's the way the world is. They're closed-minded when it comes to the gospel. They'll take yoga. They'll take Hinduism, which is part of yoga, and Brahmanism, Islam, all those other kind of things. They're okay. Just don't talk to me about Christ. We can say our mantras in the school as we go through our yoga, but don't ever say the name of Jesus. We've got to be closed-minded, folks. There is an absolute truth. And that truth is Jesus. There may be some things in the Bible you and I can disagree on, and we won't see eye to eye on, and we can be a bit flexible on those things. But there are certain inalienable truths. There can be no flexibility. And one of them is that all have sinned and come short of the glory of God. And the only hope for anybody is Jesus Christ. We may all be climbing up the hill to meet God, as the Baha'i and some others suggest. But I tell you that only those who knew Jesus is going to meet him. The rest of them are going to come to a cliff they can't pass over. And that's dogmatic. That's narrow-minded. But folks, if we do anything less, we've compromised the gospel for polytheism and pantheism and pluralism, all these other isms that have swept across our country and is a real effort to destroy the evangelistic thrust of the church. Oh, let's get on some good stuff here. Monotheism. Brother, flip that thing back. Strictly speaking, monotheism means belief in God. Belief that God exists. And so, strictly speaking, a deist, a polytheist, and pantheist is a theist. But theism basically means, in our modern language, monotheism. In other words, one God. And it's usually used in contrast to atheism or agnosticism. Theism holds that God is both transcendent and immanent. God is above his creation. He has no common link between them, but he's also present in his creation by choice. He's not his creation. His creation is not God. He's present in creation, but he's above creation. So the first presupposition under monotheism is God is. God exists. And linked with that is he is the creator of all things. You see, Biblical presuppositionalism begins with God rather than man. And every part of a human being knows that God exists. Atheist has really got a problem, because he's got to fight his own innate nature that says God exists. Denial of the existence of God is denial of the obvious. And yet many Bible-believing Christians hold to this theistic position in their head, but they demonstrate another presupposition. And we need to remember that. I've quoted something in your notes, and I've said it's an unknown author. Actually, it came off the internet on page 30. Excellent article, came off the internet. I didn't take it off the internet. I'm not hooked up to the internet, but someone took it off and gave it to me. It says, first then we take for granted the central fact of life. The fact that God is a living being, merciful and just. That God is, and He is a rewarder of them who diligently seek Him. One must begin somewhere, and we begin here. I thought that was a good Christian statement. Everybody has to have certain basic presuppositions. Where are you going to begin? Well, the atheist begins with man. The Christian's got to begin somewhere. Where's he going to begin? That God exists and He's a rewarder of them that diligently seek Him. That's where we begin. That's our presupposition. And then from that, we move into other areas. Next presupposition is that comes out of that, or flows from the presupposition of the existence of God, is that He's the creator of all things, but that God therefore owns all things, which makes Him sovereign. We alluded to it a few minutes ago, and we'll probably come back to it after we've had our lunch. God is sovereign. He's the supreme ruler. Atheism says man is autonomous and makes his own laws. Arminianism and Pelagianism emphasizes the free will. Calvinism, the term I didn't mention, didn't have nerve to until now, stresses the sovereignty of God. And it is a reasonable culmination of monotheistic presupposition. If God exists, if He's the creator of all things, you can come to no other conclusion than that God is sovereign over everything. Any other conclusion denies His existence and His creatorship. Think about that. If God's not sovereign, how can He be the creator and owner of everything? So while many Christians believe in the sovereignty of God in a sense, they deny it by denying His sovereignty in all things, His ownership of all things. Now, following from God's sovereignty, God delegates authority. We heard about that in the previous class. He chooses representatives who are to rule in accordance with His laws. Regardless of how leaders are chosen, they are under obligation to God's sovereignty to rule according to His law. They do not have a right to make their own law. That's true of political leaders as well as church leaders. Now, most people don't have a problem with that in the church. But Ottawa and Victoria have an obligation to rule British Columbia and Canada according to the laws of God. And every law that Parliament passes needs to be evaluated in the light of God's law. And every law that does not measure up to God's law is an unjust, illegal law. Would to God our Supreme Court would judge everything according to God's law. Be a whole lot of law thrown off the law books. They're ministers of God for the punishment of evildoers. Government is to be a terror to evil. And when it ceases to be a terror to evil, it ceases to be a biblically legitimate government. Pretty thin territory here. So the whole issue comes, oh boy. What do we do with illegitimate government? See, the law has to be God's standard. It's the standard by which criminals are judged. It's the standard by which crime is determined. Rehabilitation becomes secondary to justice. The primary concern of a biblical theist is justice. And justice, I can sum it up this way. Justice requires restitution or execution. I'll say that again. Justice requires restitution or execution. If restoration cannot be made, then the only alternative is execution. And God gave capital offenses in the Bible because restitution could not be made. And the only way that it could be atoned for is by execution. As you can tell, I'm very strongly in favor of capital punishment. It's the only way that justice can be maintained. And God's Word provides justice. It's humanistic philosophy that has undercut justice. And our society has become an unjust society. All right, what about the Christian view of government? Well, it's that they are ordained of God. We obey them even though they are ungodly because God requires it of us. But they are to rule in society according to God's laws. And that does not mean that when they are grossly unjust that we blindly fall along. The excuse was, I was ordered to do it, is no good excuse. The government does not have a right to order you and I to violate God's laws. Now, I want us to be careful. My time is gone. I'll try to, maybe we can pick this up after lunch, because I don't want to leave you hanging there and say we walk out of here and we all kind of rebel against the government and go get our own army out here in the back and fight our way through this thing. That's not what I'm talking about. But in what I am talking about, it's not blind submission to gross injustices. And when rulers cease to be a terror to evil and become a terror to good works, they cease to be entitled to our obedience. And that's the constant tension in modern society. How do we as Christians submit and honor the government authorities and our political leaders and still maintain the integrity of the Scripture? It's a constant tension. And there's no easy answers. We never can have a rebellious attitude to government. But we do have to stand for righteousness and oppose injustice. I believe the Christian church should be the prophetic voice in the land. Not prophesying rebellion and walking against government and all those kind of things. But I believe they should have so established the laws of God in their own society that they can stand up and say, "Thus saith the Lord," to the law of the Lord in an unjust and wicked society. And if that means going to jail sometimes for doing it, so be it. The early church went to jail. All right, let's stop there and we'll just pick it up.